got a lot of prefacing to do with this. But the major preface is that this is something it's fairly new to me uh, as well, this plant-based dyeing. So it's something that I've been really interested for quite a while, but have only been practicing and working on and experimenting with for the last several years. So the hope today is, as the title says, to give an introduction um, and to maybe open some ideas that you may or may not have already had to, how you could incorporate this, be that on any scale that you're working on. I think this activity lends itself to uh, the smallest scale to some larger scale productions and everything in between. So that's my hope today. I'll also, okay, got him moving. Just share how I got here. As I mentioned, it's always been an interest of mine, being interested in horticulture in general, and then learning about, first of all, seeing all the myriad of colors that are present in the natural world and better understanding pigments and dyes. It's always been interesting to me, but it's always seemed a little bit too complex or yeah, a little intimidating, honestly. I heard the word mordant floating around and sounded complex. I'd never heard about that. And so honestly, as silly as that is, that was a little bit of a deterrent for me for a while. Veered clear of that, but I had heard that Japanese indigo, you didn't need a mordant, whatever that was. So I decided that that'd be a good place to start. And so several years ago, actually at the Ogden seed swap, I purchased some Japanese indigo seed from local Grand Prismatic seed company and started some plants. Did some digging on how to extract the pigment, and then kind of got lost down the rabbit hole. So that was kind of my gateway drug, if you will. Another one more preface is that I'm not doing this commercially yet. Who knows? But that's a little bit of a difference between me and some of the presenters who will follow. So there's definitely that's a limitation on the experience that I bring to this. Um, But dyeing with plant-based dyes is kind of like an onion, right? So there's many layers or levels at which you can participate, as I've mentioned. There's on one end of the spectrum, extremely basic, completely for fun, do as an afternoon activity with your kids or by yourself in the kitchen. On the other end of the spectrum, it's extremely scientifically rigorous, meticulous, methodical. Um, so everything in between. As I said, I think there's space for anyone there. Kind of trying to illustrate that. We've got the beets up top, which you can mash those up, add some hot water, stick a t-shirt in there, and it'll get a color, right? You'll dye that t-shirt. Uh, but as we'll talk about a little later, the colors are probably not going to stay. They're not going to be that uniform. That's a very kind of, again, afternoon fun activity. On the other end of the spectrum, showing here, using different types of mordants, using different concentrations, different mixes of dye stuffs, you can get quite, again, meticulous and scientifically rigorous. And there's no wrong way. One way is not right or wrong. It's just understanding as you kind of dip your toes into this, what your goals are, your audience, their goals, even if your audience is just yourself. Really understanding that, I think, is a crucial first step. So I want to go over kind of just some fundamental components, right? So there's three here, and we'll talk about each of these a little more in depth. But you need the fiber. I'm showing you here some wool yarn. You need the mordant, if needed, usually is. We'll mention just a few where it's not. And then you need the dye stuff, right? So this is a huge, wide-ranging category. I'm focusing today mostly on some flowers and some dyes you can get from flowers, largely because I feel like that's most accessible. to people. Many of you are probably growing a lot of these, and we'll talk about some of those kind of ubiquitously grown flowers or more commonly grown that you could also use as some dye stuffs if you're interested. So starting off with the fiber, we'll say broadly that you're going to need natural fibers for plant-based dyeing. Um, these include, cotton wool, silk, linen, hemp, rayon, some of these newer fabrics such as like tencel or lyocell or bamboo fibers. You can use those as well. Some of those they're cellulose based. Those should dye well. Um, those natural fibers are broadly broken into protein fibers and then cellulosic fibers. So the protein fibers, things like wool and silk. Um, I'm saying here they're typically easier, quote unquote, to dye. They in general they take the dye a little better, easier. They retain that dye a little more than cellulose fibers, but you can use both. Um, in general, the cellulosic fibers, things like cotton, linen, cotton is most commonly used, of course. Those need to achieve kind of the best colors and the best light fastness and rub and wash fastness. They usually need one more step for pre-processing, which we'll talk about here, which is the mordanting step. So this word mordant, I mentioned it was new to me. I'd listened to some people talk about dyeing, and they're always talking about mordants. What is a mordant? Well, most basic, a mordant is a metallic salt. So there's lots of different types of mordants. Um, and I think of the mordant simply as the middle connecting piece that's connecting the dye to the fiber. Um, you know, you can get way more complex and there's a lot of chemistry that's involved, but that's the way I think about it, is it's the middleman connecting those two pieces. It's needed in most situations. Aside from a few dyes, such as Japanese indigo or just indigo, and some things that are really high in tannins, which I'll mention again in just a little bit, things like black walnut. Those you can get away without using a mordant, but in the cases that I'm talking about today, a mordant is really needed, and I have a picture coming up on that to really achieve those colors that you're seeing in the dye pot. So I get a lot of questions as to how to set the dyes. Um, how do you make these dyes, resistant to fading, to washing, rub fastness, increase that rub fastness. In most cases, the mordanting process is what's going to help that. So there are some post-dyeing things that you can do, but the vast majority of that color integrity is going to be enhanced and preserved through that mordanting process. You'll hear, and potentially read in some blogs about people using a mordant as like a salt, just table salt or vinegar. Um, these aren't true mordants in the technical sense of the word. They can have some similar results, um, and they are, more readily accessible to anyone in their kitchen. Um, but they're not going to perform the same tasks that a metallic salt mordant will do. Um, Depending on which mordant I mentioned, there's a lot of different types, and I'm just listing here a few. They can influence the color. So the one that you'll run across most and hear about most is called alum. That's kind of an umbrella term that's referring to several different mordants that are derived from aluminum. That's going to give you probably the truest color from what your dye bath is showing. There's also an iron. There's different types of iron mordant. Those I have in here parentheses will sadden. It's the term you often use, which means it can usually shift the color from a more bright color to kind of a darker. It can shift yellows to greens. Um, and so that's something that often is is performed. You can mordant with iron before, but often people will use an iron dip afterwards to kind of shift those colors. There's also copper and tin. There's even chromium. There's some more harsh mordants that are used industrially, but I wouldn't recommend those to any home dyer or anyone starting out. The one you're going to probably be most familiar with and use the most is going to be alum. I mentioned here at the bottom that cotton greatly benefits from a prior tannin bath. So that's that one more pre-processing step. Um, Cotton fibers, cellulose fibers in general, are not naturally attracted to the dye stuff, but even to the metallic salts, to the mordants. And this tannin pre-processing acts again as another middle link in that chain that's linking this all together. Uh, One source that's quite readily available for tannin that I've been using is just shown here, smooth sumac. Grows native here, Rus glabra. You can use the leaves, collecting from the leaves to use that, boil those, get a decoction for your tannin bath. Want to mention here as well that you can reuse your mordant bath. The question comes up about, natural dyeing uses a lot of water. And so one way to reduce that is to keep your mordant bath. It can keep pretty much indefinitely. And as you add a little more of that metallic salt to it, you can reuse that mordant bath indefinitely. Want to show here just the kind of drastic difference. This main backing piece, this is cotton, was put into a tannin bath and then mordanted with alum, and then it was dyed with marigold flowers. And you can see, I think, the beautiful color. This little cotton swatch on top of it was just thrown in unmordanted to the same dye bath, so you can see that kind of extreme difference in color and the important role that mordants play in achieving that color that you want. So we have the fiber, the mordant, now the dye. Where does that come from? Well, there's kind of infinite number of sources, right? There's many sources of dye, fewer that are quote unquote classic dyes or classical dyes. Those that are kind of considered the classic dyes have been shown used more frequently because they are more light fast, they're more rub fast. And I always say, when I say light and rub fast, just means they're more tolerant of physical abrasion, they're more tolerant of UV light. They're tolerant of different heat and pH changes. Those are kind of some characteristics of the classical dyes. But there are many great dyes that are not classic, right? And again, this all kind of harkens back to your goals. Things like onion skins, red cabbage, black beans, scabiosa, which I'm showing here. Those are all very fun dye sources, and they give beautiful colors. They're going to be, the word that they use is more fugitive. So that means they're not going to last as long. They're going to fade more. They're going to fade maybe a little more unattractively. But again, depending on your goals, depending on your usage of what you're dyeing, they can be, there's all sorts of fun dye sources. So can't go through all those, but some Google searches, some reading, some research will really open up that world as to just how much you can use. I do want to show here, though, some common things, some things that I grew this last year. The scabiosa, marigold, cosmos. This is a cosmos sulphureus, dyer's chamomile. Things not mentioned here or pictured here: rudbeckia, coreopsis, hollyhock, the dark hollyhocks, some sunflowers. There's just a ton of different flowers. Again, kind of focusing here on flowers, but there's a ton that can be used that you potentially are growing. Then the question down here comes, well, how much, fabric can one plant dye? And that's, wouldn't be an extension talk without giving the answer. It depends. And it does. It depends on the shade you're hoping to achieve. Depends on how much fabric you're dyeing. But I think is a good starting point. Saying here, if it's fresh or frozen, 3 to 5 times the weight of fabric, or WOF, is a good place to start. And that can give you kind of a baseline shade or color, and then you can kind of play and dial back or dial up the amount of dye stuff that you're using to get different colors. Um, I wanted to mention here, I have fresh or frozen. Uh, there's kind of two ways. If you're not using fresh material, you can either freeze it or you can dry it. Those are kind of the two main ways to preserve those dye stuffs beyond that growing season to use for dyeing. How to extract the dye? Again, this can vary a little bit depending on your dye stuff. Focusing here on some flowers, the usual method is to add some water to cover the amount of plant material that you're using, to heat usually up to a boil for 30 to 60 or more minutes. To remove that dye stuff, I'm showing here that I've just encapsulated that in some mesh, or yeah, some fine mesh bags. So I can just take that out after the boiling. You allow that extract to cool down, and then you introduce your fiber and usually start and reheat that dye bath for 30 or more minutes. Sometimes it can be less depending on the color you're trying to achieve. And you'll want to be, agitating or moving that fabric, again, depending on the type of fiber. You won't want to be felting if you're using wool, but you'll want to keep that moving in the dye bath to get a uniform color. After you'll pull that out, you'll rinse that with water until it's running clear, and then usually if you're using, for most dyes, you can get a clean pot of water and do a boil finish for about 10 minutes. And just showing here, you can get any number, the whole range of colors from natural dyes. So there's just some real beautiful things you can achieve that I think, are are extremely unique, and it's hard to find outside of kind of the natural dye palette. One slide, just including one slide here on indigo. There's a whole world here, and I just felt it wouldn't really do to try and fit it all in a few slides, and maybe doing more disservice in just one slide. But there's many sources of indigo. The one that I've been using the most is Japanese indigo. There's also woad, which is a registered noxious weed in Utah, has the same chemical precursors that'll give you indigo. One of the special things about indigo, as I mentioned, is there's no mordant that's needed. It uses a different set of chemical reactions to do the dyeing. And so yeah, there's a whole world here, and I can't get into a lot of it, but there's fresh, there's vat dyeing, there's a magical process when you lift it from the vat dyeing, where it changes from this reduced state to oxidized, and it turns blue in front of your eyes. It's a really, really fun process. The extraction process is also quite fun. It's a little more involved. I'm just showing here this photo on the top left, where you're submerging and fermenting that plant material to eventually pull out the indigo powder. So it's a fun process, and I'll show a few references at the end if you're interested in learning more. Okay, the question comes always, will it fade? Will the colors fade? And the answer is yes. Sorry, you can log off now if that was your question. They will fade. I'm showing here some of the testing that I've done just on some little grow lights that I use. Usually I lower them down even more, so they're right above that fabric, the test swatches. I'll cover up half of that and then expose that for a certain period of time, and look at how much it's fading. I mentioned that some dyes, some of these that aren't the classical dyes, will fade quicker or maybe a little bit more unattractive. Anthocyanin dyes, so anything containing an anthocyanin, will usually fade quite quickly, comparatively. How do you deal with this? Well, you can select dyes that are more tried and true and more light fast. Just listing a few here, indigo. Weld is a flowering plant that is kind of one of the more traditional standards for yellow. Madder is used to get some red colors. The other way to deal with it is just to embrace the fade. It's going to happen. Again, I think that's one of the it's a living process, so you're going to get that. Again, depends on the use for the fiber, right? If it's going to be exposed to a lot of UV rays, it's going to fade. But showing here just a few test swatches that I've done using that same method that I described. So you can see some of them here in the bottom right, that's using that scabiosa. And that was, almost a deep blue, purple, gunmetal color. And that fades quite quickly. And you can see the fade is maybe a little bit more unattractive, some would say. In the bottom left here is marigold. That's also fading. This is after I think about a month of kind of like direct light on it. And so you can see they're fading, right? Some of them are keeping more or less true to their hue and color. Some are fading quite differently. So some considerations here. I'm listing minimum supplies. I don't know if that's totally true. I have here a stainless steel pot. That's kind of the traditionally used vessel for a dye bath, because with other pots like aluminum pots, you're introducing again some more aluminum, which we've learned is a mordant, and so that can help or it can hurt depending on what you want and what you're doing. So people usually dye in a stainless steel pot. It's non-reactive. Having a heat source is quite helpful. Water source. I didn't touch on this. The water quality can affect your dyeing. That said, all the dyeing I've been doing has just been with tap water, so it's, as we all know in Utah, there's a lot of mineral deposit in it, and it's worked okay. You'll need what we talked about: the fiber, the mordant, the dye stuff, and then odds and ends that you really won't maybe think of until you're doing the process. But just a few of those: a strainer, a dye stick or some tongs, 5-gallon buckets of your friends, and they're cheap and easy, and you can reuse them. You'll learn as you go what are going to be those crucial things for you in your setup. But again, as I mentioned, if you want to preserve that dye stuff, having some freezer space or some drying space will also be necessary. Uh, Caveat here to keep your dye pots away from your cooking pots. Hopefully that's self-evident, but putting that as the disclaimer here. Also, some considerations if you are thinking of adding this maybe as a value-added product in your operation, or potentially, commercializing it. I'd say give yourself plenty of time to play, to experiment, to research before, you enter that market, just to get your process more honed in and understand what the different variables are going to do with your product. So just showing here again these little test swatches. There's any number of combinations you can do with the mordants, with the time in the dye vat, in the bath. And then you can show here this whole stack I did of that light fastness, depending on the different mordants and pre-processing. So use those small swatches, use various fibers, depending again upon what's available to you, what your setup is. Showing here some roving, some wool yarn, some cotton. They're going to take up the dyes differently. They're going to have different colors, and it's really fun to experiment with those. I use just little quart jars for test batches. You can see here, all sorts of things. I tried some stuff with thistles, tried some stuff with bindweed, which actually gives a fun yellow. So there's infinite things you can try, and I'd say that's part of the fun of it. That's part of what could make your product unique potentially, is what you're using, along with the various fibers, and to remember to document what you do. Don't expect perfectly repeatable and uniform colors. That's what makes your product unique. It's also potentially very frustrating. It can be. And again, if you're thinking of commercializing some sort of this, remember it's a small batch product. It is time consuming. You're going to be looking to sell to consumers who recognize and understand this, appreciate that, and are willing to pay the premium that makes it worth your time. I didn't put it on here, but as opposed to selling an end product like this, you could sell potentially dried flowers. There's different products that you could potentially commercialize if you're thinking of adding this into your operation. Lastly, I'll just say there's a lot of resources out there, of course. Understand the target audience of the book or of the resource, I think is important. In aligning with your goals, there's a lot of knowledgeable blogs out there as well, and published books. I'm just showing kind of a smattering here that I've read that have been really helpful for me. I found as a good litmus test to kind of determine their audience has been whether they even mention anything about color fastness or light fastness. If they're not mentioning anything about that, then it's high likelihood that they're maybe not. It's more for fun, right? And so that's just been a little helpful litmus
We're
test
gonna
for me.
have to wrap up here for questions. We have one, but I know you're getting close to the end, so.
Yes. Yep. Done here. I wouldn't be an academic without mentioning my own stuff. We put out some fact sheets for dyeing with indigo, extraction process and whatnot. But that's it, I think. Yes.
Oh, I want to hear
Any
about those
questions?
fact sheets. That's fantastic that you have that content out for people. Maggie, do you want to take a look at the questions? Everyone, if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A.
Yeah, we got a couple questions here for you, Wes. Question one, do you ever host hands-on or like how-to workshops on plant-based dyeing?
Yes, I have, and I will continue to do so. It's a little difficult to do it to scale up, and so it's a lot of work, but we have done it, and so we'll plan to keep doing it.